Hello and happy Constitution Day. I'm Liz Cavell, Deputy Legal Director at the Freedom from Religion Foundation.
And I'm Chris Line, Rapid Legal Counsel at FFRF. And as Liz said, today is Constitution Day, celebrating the signing of the U.S. Constitution by our founding fathers. But unfortunately, many of our rights as defined by the Constitution are under attack, and that's what we'll be focusing on today. So you might be familiar with today's guest. Andrew Seidel is the VP of Strategic Communications at Americans United for Separation of Church and State. He's a leading expert on Christian nationalism, the author of 2 books on the subject, and host of the podcast One Nation, Indivisible. And of course, Andrew is formerly a constitutional attorney here at FFRF. Welcome back, Andrew.
Hey, thank you for having me on. I love the new set, friends. It's quite good.
Yeah, we cleaned up after you left. We were like, let's do something. Let's just make it a little better.
We need a refresh after that guy. Let's get some new vibes in here. Yeah, I like it.
Andrew, you've done a ton of research and writing, not just about constitutional law, like we are steeped in here, but also constitutional history and legal history. So that's why we wanted you on today, to sort of pick your brain about Constitution Day. So let's just start out with what is Constitution Day? Why does it matter? What are we celebrating?
Yeah, well, first of all, that's a really nice way of saying that I'm a nerd. Thank you. I appreciate that. Constitution Day is important because the Constitution is important. And especially now where we have so many people who are in power essentially feeding that document into a paper shredder, or, lighting it on fire with a blowtorch or trampling it underfoot, whatever metaphor you want to choose, they don't seem to respect or care about it. And certainly not the oaths that they have promised, they've sworn, they've taken to uphold that document. And so I think taking one day out of the year to recognize, hey, this is the document that really governs our entire system, our legal system, our system of laws, our government, all the way from the president to the Supreme Court, all 3 branches, plus the fact that at this particular time, just as we are seeing this sort of slide into authoritarianism and fascism, it really seems crucial to hold on to this as a governing document. It's something that it's not just that we have norms and traditions that should guide our behavior, but we have the rule of law, and it is embodied in the U.S. Constitution that is being kind of run over today.
Yeah, and in particular with our Constitution, the thing we focus on most here at FFRF sort of is the secular aspect, the fact that it's we have a godless Constitution, but we've seen over time those people you're talking about, Christian nationalists, talking about how that's not necessarily true. This is a pretty broad question for you, Andrew, but what do Christian nationalists get wrong about the Constitution?
Everything. I mean, in particular, what you've identified, right, is the separation of church and state is what prevents Christian nationalists from abusing government power to impose their personal religious beliefs on everybody else, on your kids in public schools, to take just one example. So that wall of separation is one of the major targets of this group, because it's the barrier that prevents them from realizing their goal of codifying legal privilege for the right kind of conservative Christian. And that wall of separation is really remarkable. It is an American original. It's an American invention, right? The idea was out there before the Constitution was written, but it was first implemented in our Constitution, in the American experiment. Until then, there was no other nation in the history of the world had sought to protect the ability of its citizens to think freely by separating religion and government. And now, that's something that I do think we can be proud of, and I think that we need to fight for it, and we certainly shouldn't let people undermine it with myths about a Christian founding. And I'm happy to dive deeper into where that's located and all that fun stuff if you want. I will nerd out as much as you want, but I can already see Liz rolling her eyes at me a little bit.
I was just looking down. Don't go too deep, but we do want to talk about how Christian nationalists distort the Constitution, the founding moment of the signing of the Constitution that we're celebrating today. Like, how is that distorted by Christian nationalists and theocrats in this country in order to claim the American founding as a Christian endeavor and to claim we're a Christian nation?
Yeah, I mean, they invent a bunch of half truths, create a series of myths to build up this, not just this idea that we're founded as a Christian nation, it's an entire identity that is based on that disinformation, right? Christian nationalism is not a scholarly debate about our history or about how the Constitution was written or anything like that. What you just identified is it's a sinister exclusionary movement. It's an attempt to redefine America according to that Christian nationalist disinformation, and then reshape the law and reshape society. And I'm also talking about demographics here in that image. To give one example that we heard recently, when Trump's Religious Liberty Commission met at the Museum of the Bible, they pushed one of these pieces of disinformation, and they talked about the prayer proposal that Ben Franklin had during the Constitutional Convention. And this is one of the only mentions of religion during the entire Constitutional Convention. And if you listen to them push this claim, they act like not only was the prayer proposed, but they followed through on it. They don't tell you what actually happened, which is that after Franklin proposed that prayer, it was rejected by the members at the Constitutional Convention. And Franklin, in his own handwriting, we actually have this, you can see it today. He writes at the bottom of his page of notes, he says, the Constitution, except for 3 or 4 persons, thought prayer unnecessary. So they didn't pray, and there's a really great apocryphal story about Alexander Hamilton saying, "Oh, we didn't need foreign aid to draft our Constitution." In response to that, probably not true. But I would love to be able to go out there and talk about how that's true, and they didn't want foreign aid, they didn't want some God coming in and writing it. But I tend to stick with facts and reality, whereas Christian nationalists are really intent on bending it to their will, and it's not just the prayer at the Constitutional Convention. It's one nation under God, and in God we trust, and the Declaration of Independence referencing the Christian God 4 different times, and George Washington kneeling in the snow at Valley Forge and praying in the Golden Rule, and that our laws are all based on the 10 Commandments. And none of that is true. And without their origin myths, their identity, their entire identity begins to wither and fade. And I actually think this is one of their Achilles heel, because when people do learn the truth, they tend to shed that Christian nationalism pretty quickly.
Right, like you're putting out all these facts that build up this sort of compelling narrative or whatever. I happen to have I was Googling Constitution Day, and unfortunately one of the top results, it does come from David Barton and Wall Builders, and I was kind of reading through that, where it's explaining oh, they act like the founders were atheists, agnostics, and deists, but here's 2 or 3 quotes from each founding father that is remotely positive about religion generally. So clearly that's not the case. But then obviously we know at the same time they'll say well, Thomas Jefferson just said separation of church and state in a letter, ignoring obviously all the plethora of writings and scholarly stuff about that, whereas obviously the religious stuff was more of a pass-through. But it was alarming to see David Barton on there. And as you know, David Barton and Wall Builders has done a tremendous job of just getting all these people to share, PragerU, other groups that are just regurgitating, politicians regurgitating all of the things that he said. And they've just done a really good job just building up this whole narrative that makes it seem like this is real. To people who don't know, they would come off as facts and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, you're certainly right. And for folks who don't know David Barton, I mean, David Barton is the granddaddy of Christian nationalist disinformation. So many of the myths, including much of what I just mentioned a moment ago, so many of the myths, the talking points especially, that are used to push those myths trace back to David Barton and his group Wall Builders, including, you mentioned politicians. Mike Johnson recently said that, separation of church and state was a misnomer. Lauren Boebert talked about how it's from a stinking letter. Pete Hegseth said something similar. It's nowhere in our founding documents. And that's wrong, right? It is. The exact phrase, of course, comes from the letter that Thomas Jefferson wrote to the Danbury Baptists on New Year's Day in 1802. But it's also, that metaphor is a simple way to distill what could otherwise be a complicated topic for some people. And the Supreme Court itself has endorsed that metaphor many, many times, for the first time in 1878, then again in 1947 and 1948, 1961 three times, 62, 63, 68, 73, 70, and on and on and on, and then countless other opinions by lower courts and dissents. It is a founding American principle, and it's woven into other parts of our Constitution, which is something that people like Lauren Boebert, shockingly, do not understand, that they either deliberately miss or have bought into a lot of that disinformation that David Barton is out there peddling.
Before we kind of move on to what the really urgent threats are to our constitutional rights, just talk a little bit about why the separation of church and state is so important, and also, like, in this current moment, why it's more urgent than ever. Like, why is this constitutional principle so vital to, like, the survival of our constitutional republic?
There's a number of reasons. I mean, the first, and I think the one that probably most viewers would sympathize with, is that it is the thing that protects your right to think freely, whether it's about religion or other things. And if you actually look at what the First Amendment protects, you can see that the First Amendment is really looking at protecting the freedom of thought. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people to peaceably assemble and petition the government for a redress of grievances. All of those are about ideas and communicating ideas and freeing up the ability of people to communicate those ideas. But that first part, the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause, are really about that freedom of thought. And I do think it's really crucial, and we should spend a little time talking today about, like, how the separation of church and state is much broader than the First Amendment, and the fact that we have cabined it as a legal profession to one clause of one part of the First Amendment is been done to our detriment, and something that our opponents have taken advantage of. But it first of all, it protects your ability to think freely. Second of all, it protects your ability to act on those thoughts freely. That's part of the free exercise of religion, and that also includes us non-believers in it. Now, that's not an unlimited right, as some Christian nationalists would tell you, right? Like, your rights do not give you a right to violate somebody else's rights. This is what we talk about when we talk about religious freedom becoming a license to discriminate. Religious freedom has never been an unlimited right. It's always been limited by the rights of other people.
Until now.
Just like your right to... Until now. But it's supposed to be that your right to swing your fists ends at the other person's nose. It's supposed to be that your right to exercise your religion ends where the rights of other people begin. But that is one thing that the Supreme Court is doing its damnedest to change. And it's why we're seeing so many problems today. And those are just two reasons. I mean, it also, if you care about having an educated populace, which most of our founders did, they thought that was necessary to in a democratic society, like being able to have, for instance, a functioning public school system in a pluralistic society requires a certain separation of church and state. And it's not even saying, hey, religion is wrong or religion isn't important, which is what the Christian nationalists say and people like David Barton would use to attack us. It's just saying that you decide that on your own. And the state is not going to come in. We're not going to have politicians deciding the religious education of other people's children. We're going to leave that up to y'all if you so choose.
The fact that we've had secularism for so long and a secular government is probably what kind of hurts people from realizing that issue. You know, they think, oh, well, when we put religion into schools, it's going to be my religion, obviously. Like, there's not going to be any, like, issue. We're all going to be on the same page about what we do here. You know, it's been, because we've had our secular country, they're not aware, they don't realize, they're not thinking ahead to, oh, what problems are going to come up when, like, we do let the state decide religion in our schools and decide what religion should be favored and what specific religious ideology should be taught and this and that and everything. I think we're kind of a victim of our own success in that way.
It's kind of like
100%.
It's kind of like vaccines in that way, where, like, you don't know a world without, you know, the the peace and the success and the health that like this thing has brought you. So you can't see the dangers of changing or weakening the system. It's like state church separation, our Constitution and our First Amendment is probably literally the reason why we are one of the only nations in the history of the world that has not had a religious civil war. We have not had, religious factional fighting that is political, because our government and our personal religious beliefs has been separate. Like, people don't realize how essential that is to the project of a constitutional Bill of Rights, a rule of law that says that all citizens are equal under the law, right? Like there's no first-class citizenship based on religion or other characteristics. Like, we've never lived, well, it's not true that we've never lived another way, but I think people don't realize how essential the First Amendment and particularly the religion clauses are to living in that way and a full realization of the freedom that our Constitution kind of imagined.
I think that's absolutely right. And I think Melinda Gates said something very similar to the vaccine point, which I think is the perfect analogy here, which is that the reason you see this anti-vax movement coming of age in the United States and in the first world is that we have not seen what it is like to watch children die of measles or being choked to death by diphtheria and things that were a true reign of terror on much of humanity for our existence. We were able to eradicate them with science. And now that we don't have that threat hanging over our head, it is created in this way, this like little bit of a backlash movement. And unfortunately, we are going to start to see what happens when kids die of measles and very preventable diseases. And Chris, I think the phrase "victims of our success" is right on the money. I mean, that is what is happening with separation of church and state. And it's true that we've never perfected the separation of church and state in this country. For instance, it's always been an aspiration, one that we've never attained. And we kind of go up, we have ups and downs, but we're definitely on a backslide right now. And a big part of it is because of exactly what you are identifying. People are selfish and solipsistic when it comes to their personal religion. And they assume when the government is endorsing a religion, when the government is praying to a God, when a teacher is pushing a particular scripture in the classroom, that it's gonna be mine. And we know from history, and this is why the founders chose to separate church and state, that that's not true, right? And to your point, Liz, the founders wrote, James Madison wrote about the, quote, torrents of blood that had been spilled in the old world by trying to reach some sort of, uniform religious conclusion, which was just absolutely impossible. And it's still impossible to this day, even more so now that we've got, so much diversity, which is incidentally bred by the separation of church and state.
Well, we should stop stalling and move on to how our constitutional rights are so under threat today, maybe, more so than any time in like very recent legal history, but particularly on topic for us, like with regard to the expansion of religious privilege under the law. And the balance between sort of the competing rights that are embodied in the religion clauses. So talk a little bit about like the most recent Supreme Court decisions that have accelerated this sort of imbalance and this religious privilege under the law and why it's a threat to everyone's right to religious freedom.
I mean, I think the place to start with that is with Justice Sotomayor's dissent in the Carson versus Macon case from 2022, where she writes something along the lines of what a difference 5 years makes. In 2017, I was worried that this court was leading us to a place where the separation of church and state was slogan, to a place where today the court has declared that the separation of church and state is a constitutional violation. We are at an absurd place in jurisprudence. And like, this is the reason that people hate lawyers, because effectively what the Supreme Court has done is it has looked at the religion clauses of the First Amendment, and we'll just take a moment and spell those out. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. Okay, that's the Establishment Clause, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. That's the Free Exercise Clause. Together, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. It's one phrase. It's not even a full sentence. It's one phrase, one part of one sentence in the Constitution. And what the Supreme Court has effectively done in its most recent decade and a half or so of cases is said that the first part of that part of a sentence violates the second part of that part of a sentence. And I mean, it is just beyond absurd to have arrived at that moment. That the free exercise clause is now this black hole that against swallows, I think was the word that Sotomayor used in her dissent, everything around it. And these are justices who profess themselves to be textualists, who care about every single word and piece of punctuation, and originalists who care about the original meaning of those words. And they have arrived at this absurd singularity where one clause of a sentence of the Constitution is now read as a violation of a subsequent clause of the same sentence of the Constitution. It boggles the mind how absurd this is. And if you were to state this blindly and look at it from any kind of detached view, it simply cannot be right. It cannot be what the founders meant. This cannot be a valid interpretation. And again, this is the reason that people hate lawyers, but this is where we are now. And you know, it goes back to I kind of really date sort of the beginning of the of this to 2010 thereabouts. There's a case involving a cross in the Mojave Desert where the Supreme Court kind of looks at this, and there's a land swap that happens. Basically, the cross is challenged as a violation of the separation of church and state because it's on public land, it's on government land, and Congress swaps out, a couple square feet underneath the cross and says, "Oh, it's not on public land anymore; it can stay up." And the land swap only works if it goes to a group that's going to keep the cross up. So the whole point of this government action is to keep the cross up. And the Supreme Court's like, yeah, we're cool with that as a way to fix this. And that case kind of opens the floodgates. And then you see virtually every term, or at least one case on average every term, coming down that is advancing and moving and changing this. So in 2011, you get a vouchers decision that says sending taxpayer funds to religious schools is basically okay. We're going to allow that, and they do that by denying the ability to challenge that program. Excuse me. Then in 2012, you get an expansion of this idea where religious organizations can effectively legally discriminate when they're hiring clergy, and that becomes expanded into being used against employees who have no religious duties. And then in 2014, we get some of the government prayer case out of town of Greece. We get the Hobby Lobby decision in 2017. Taxpayers are forced to fund a Lutheran children's ministry. In 2018, we get all of a sudden this rediscovery of hostility toward religion as a tool for the Supreme Court to use, and they use it in the Masterpiece Cake Shop case to decide in favor of a bakery denying the civil rights of LGBTQ people, which, by the way, immediately afterwards, they allow Trump's Muslim ban to stand. So after promoting all that hostility towards Christians, they let the Muslim ban stand. And then in 2019, we get the full cross in the Bladensburg cross case being upheld. And then, I mean, on and on and on. And in 2021, 22 is a banner year. It gets worse and worse and worse every year. And there's some really terrible and fascinating data that some law professors have done to dig this up, which shows that we're not just talking about this being a trend where we are actually seeing that Christians and just Christians are winning more and more and more at this court under John Roberts, going from what you would expect to be like a 50-50 shot of winning to winning like 80 to 90% of the time at this court, because this court is on a crusade.
That was quite the like tour de force through some of the case law, especially in the last 20 years. But I think like you didn't dig into the facts in any particular case too much, but I think it's like important to understand that there's like two things going on, and it's a big part of it is the just subordination of the Establishment Clause to the point of irrelevancy. And some of that project is embodied in some of the just Establishment Clause cases that the Roberts Court has taken, and this turn towards a history and tradition analysis of what violates the Establishment Clause, which is just like infinitely malleable to mean whatever the courts want it to mean, which in most cases is nothing. But then there's this other thing going on, which is in a case, whether it's an Establishment Clause case or it involves an Establishment Clause interest or not, if it involves a free exercise interest, particularly of a Christian litigant, it is the just elevation of that right, or like the swallowing, as you put it, or as Sotomayor put it, of every other interest, including the state interest in respecting the Establishment Clause. It's just the elevating of the individual, especially Christian citizens' right to free exercise with no boundaries whatsoever placed on action by civil law. And it's that like imbalance that is also a really rapid departure from the way that the Supreme Court used to treat these cases, even when the Supreme Court has not always been robust or
it hasn't been great.
It hasn't been consistent, let's say, with regard to enforcing the Establishment Clause in every context with the same amount of like rigidity and robustness. But like what it hasn't done so consistently until now is like elevate the free exercise rights of a particular individual religious demographic above every other legal interest that could arise in a case. And that's happening in the cases that involve Establishment Clause interests, like the school prayer cases, the coach-led prayer case. That's an Establishment Clause case. But this court framed that as a case about the religious rights of this individual coach. Secondary concerns are the context. We're in a public school. The pattern and practice of behavior of this public school official, Coach Kennedy, all that is secondary. All this court cares about elevating above all other concerns is the narrative that individual Christians need to have their rights to act protected above all else.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is absolutely correct, and I think it's not just individual Christians; it's individual Christian organizations, even, right? Like a lot of these cases involve taxpayer funds flowing to churches or parachurch organizations or religious organizations who are claiming I'm discriminated if I don't get access to the taxpayer funds that I want. And another way to frame it, what you're talking about, instead of Establishment Clause versus Free Exercise Clause, is whose religious freedom do the conservative justices on the Supreme Court care about? And it is always the conservative Christian person or group that is bringing the case, and everybody else's religious freedom, middle finger to them. And so think about the case of the coach who was imposing his prayer on other people's kids, right? Like, nowhere do those kids get a mention as though their religious freedom is being trampled by a state actor, right? Like, that is just not in the majority's opinion in that case. Nowhere in the cases involving, we are taking money from you, citizens, we're taking money out of your pocket and turning around and giving it to a religious organization that may say that you're going to hell, right? I mean, in that case, we're talking about like mandatory funding of religion, which was one of the things that the founders were most against. Thomas Jefferson called it sinful and tyrannical. And The court ignores, just flat out ignores, does not even mention that the religious freedom of every single person who is being forced by their government, coerced into financially supporting a religious organization with a religious mission. It's government enforced funding of a church, right? Tithing, government enforced tithing. And the religious freedom of everybody who is suffering through that is completely unmentioned at this court. So even it's not just Establishment Clause versus Free Exercise Clause. It's we don't care about the religious freedom of anybody else except for the Christian person or group who is bringing this case. It's infuriating.
Yeah, we've seen, this administration, because of Project 2025 from the Heritage Foundation, you mentioned earlier the Religious Liberty Commission. They have an anti-Christian bias task force. That's all sort of on the executive policy side. But we just want to bring up now that I'm sure you saw this probably, Andrew, that Heritage Foundation is now set to publish an 800-page analysis of the Constitution with a preface by Justice Alito that will be a neutral and thorough accounting of the Constitution's original meaning. So probably this is going to be our, Project 2025 was sort of the executive and how to take over and dismantle the Constitution through our executive branch. And now we see that they're going to write out what they want to do. I mean, not that we haven't been able to figure out what they're doing through the courts with the Constitution, but I think this is going to be an even more explicit, literally line by line of the Constitution of like, here's what we're going to try to reinterpret this to mean.
I mean, neutral and thorough accounting of the Constitution's original meaning is just hilarious. I mean, again, this is the same group that is arguing that this part of this sentence of the Constitution violates the immediate next words of the Constitution. They actually think that the founders got together and wrote a sentence that not only contradicts itself, but that says that the earlier part is a violation of the latter part. It is insane. It's insane. And I mean, this is, of course, par for the course. And, the Second Amendment, under this originalist, textualist interpretation, just ignores entire clauses talking about well-regulated militia, right? Like that's pointless. No. All of a sudden, we're just talking about the right of the people to keep and bear arms. It is a hollow, completely. I mean, textualism and originalism they're just a hollow. To call them any illegal interpretation is even too much. They're not. I mean, it is conservative politics masquerading as legal analysis.
Yeah, nothing inappropriate about a sitting Supreme Court justice writing the forward for this thing, though. So to anyone who thinks we need a judicial code of conduct, I think we're fine. So let's talk about what can be done. Like, how are organizations like ours pushing back, but also like, what can citizens do to save our Constitution?
Yeah, I mean, that I think is the big question that everybody's asking themselves today. I mean, at its heart, the Constitution is a document that is about self-government. And I'll be the first to say, like, I think there's actually there's a lot that's wrong with our Constitution. There's a lot that if I were, king for a day, which our Constitution doesn't allow, that I would change. I think there's a lot that they got wrong, but there are some things that it got right. And there are aspirations that are written into that we've never been able to fully achieve, oftentimes in large part because the Supreme Court tends to be a retrogressive body. But I think that one of the clear commands and one of the clear protections that the Constitution offers to us is self-government. And one of the things that the Declaration of Independence also kind of spends a little bit of time on. And that is something that is worth fighting for, and that stands fundamentally opposed to the kind of authoritarianism that we see ourselves sliding towards right now. And this is a question that, I've kind of been asking myself as a lawyer, and as just somebody who cares about this country and as a professional communicator in this space. And I think that really the answer is there has to be some sort of a national movement. And we've seen hints of this. We've seen it building. I mean, I do think we need to see more mass protests. We need to see more people in the streets. There is, if you've been following along, and I can't recall the name of the book right now, but I did read a book earlier this summer, which was sort of a scholarly analysis of successful political civil revolutions versus violent revolutions in countries, and what makes them succeed and what doesn't. And it does suggest that if you get 3 to 4% of the population out there mobilized regularly, that things will change. And that's like one of the best markers of success. And that means taking to the streets. It means no kings rallies, which, I believe we all went to here in Madison, and really kind of getting out there and fighting for your rights and standing up for it in whatever way you can. And it's the temptation right now is to put your head down and to go along to get along and to be quiet. There's so much happening. There's so much that going on. And I just want to tell people, like, you do not have to keep up with all of the news. You do not have to know what is happening every moment of every day. You do not have to be on social media, but you should be out in the streets when those protests are being organized, and you should be marching and should be volunteering to reclaim our Constitution wherever you can. I mean, FFRF and Americans United have partnered up to take a number of cases across the country. For instance, we're challenging the 10 Commandments in Texas, in Louisiana and Arkansas together. And we don't get to do those things without brave local activists who are willing to stand up and be counted and say, yes, I'm going to take a stand against this. I'm going to put my name on a piece of paper and let you file it in court. And I'm going to defend my rights in court, even if that means, things are going to be harder for me right now. I would just encourage people to put your phone down and figure out a way that you can get involved. They want us to feel overwhelmed right now. And one of the hardest things is to fend that feeling off. And one of the best ways you can do it is to let yourself have a little bit of space from the algorithms in your hand.
Good advice. You should take it yourself. Here's a question that's fun. From the audience questions that I just want to throw out there before we wrap up. And it kind of is like, you kind of just said a lot of things that could be an answer to this, but I want you to say something else because I just think this is cute. What's a good way for me to celebrate Constitution Day?
Oh, I mean, I think read the Constitution. It is not long. It'd probably take you 20 minutes to read the Constitution. I'd be shocked if you were familiar with like 5 or 10% of it. There's so much in there. Like I reread it from time to time, and every now and then I'm like, oh, I forgot this whole thing was in here. But it really, it's not a hard read. It's a short read. And pay attention to the fact that, like most of those truly original and unique elements that are in our Constitution, those are the secular elements. Like, pay attention to the things that you would change. Pay attention to those secular elements, right? Like, and the secular stuff starts right off the bat. It starts at we the people, right? Those words, they're poetic, but there's so much more that, that our Constitution was the first to declare that power comes from people, not gods. That's that self-government that we were talking about. Our Constitution was the first governing document not to mention a god or a deity, and it's godless by choice, not by accident. And there were people who were pissed off in the founding generation and objected to that choice. And their objections were noted and rejected. Don't care. We're going godless. Our Constitution was the first to ban religious tests for public office. That's in Article 6. It's near the end of the document. And that's actually the only mention of religion in the original unamended document. And that test ban is some of the most clear and emphatic language in a document that's often deliberately vague. Right? No religious test shall ever be required as a qualification to any office or public trust. No, shall ever any. Those are, very clear, emphatic, unequivocal words in a document that often doesn't contain those. And then, after that, you get the Bill of Rights, and then the other amendments. And I think there's a whole lot that's wrong with our Constitution. Those secular foundations are what made it unique. And they're genuine contributions, not just to political science and thought, but to all humanity. And that is a really great way. Rereading it is just a really great way to honor those contributions.
I think that's actually a good if nerdy answer to the question because it's actually, you mentioned a very, or like surprisingly, I think, short and elegant document. And it's empowering to read it for yourself because, you know, some of the people that are trying to like destroy our system of government would have you believe that it takes an 800-page analysis with a foreword by Justice Alito to understand what was meant by our Constitution, what our founders meant in like setting up a framework for government. And I think sort of reading it for yourself can be an empowering experience when you're trying to kind of sort through all the noise and manipulation and disinformation that you're hearing that can sound persuasive and make it sound like it's this big, you know, daunting thing. And it's like, oh, maybe our founders did really want to obsessively prioritize the rights of Christians over everyone else. You know, I'd love to hear what the 800-page analysis has to say about the religious test language. So I might be doing a control F.
That's the first thing I'm going to go to see if they just say,
skip that.
Oh, oops. Yeah, the founders made one mistake. Just ignore this, or if they're going to somehow be like,
how many words will be
spelled? So they were all just so Christian that like we all knew that this meant no religious test for Christians, or who knows.
Totally. Okay, this one was definitely dropped in the chat by you, Andrew. Are there any books you recommend for learning more about the Constitution? Yes, you can plug your books, but also anything else.
I would definitely recommend The Founding Myth, Why Christian Nationalism is Un-American, which really gets at a lot of the myths that make up the Christian nationalist identity and that kind of torture the idea of being founded on as a secular republic. And then American Crusade tells some of that story that was super disheartening to hear, but is really important to hear about how the Supreme Court over the last 15, 20 years has really worked to weaponize religious freedom and to turn that one part of the First Amendment against everything else, and to create this hierarchy of rights for straight white conservative Christian men to be able to rule and impose their religious beliefs on everybody else. And then there are a ton of books that I cite in both of those that would be wonderful. I've also got, if people are interested, on bookshop.org, I have a number of reading lists that I try to keep updated. One for understanding Christian nationalism, and one for books that'll kind of change the way you think. And there are some con law books on those because I'm a nerd. So a non-Andrew book that I would really recommend is Allow Me to Retort by Elie Mystal, which I believe FFRF sells in its store. It's a really great critical look at the U.S. Constitution. And if you've not had a good critical read about the U.S. Constitution, you owe it to yourself to do so. And Elie is a great place to start.
Our shop at ffrf.org does sell Andrew's books. You can check out our shop and get Andrew's books and all of our merch there. And I'm going to end with this question, Andrew. Maybe it's a hopeful note, so you can't just say no. Is there any hope for these Christian nationalist cases? All these recent Christian nationalist rulings by our Supreme Court. Is there any hope of them being reversed in the future?
Yeah, I mean, I do think right now is rough. I mean, I will say, like, even now we can still win. Like, if we think about the case out of Oklahoma involving the nation's first religious public school, right? Like, Amy Coney Barrett recused herself 4-4. Oklahoma Supreme Court did the right thing, so that school was struck down. It was victory because we kept it out of the hands of the U.S. Supreme Court. So it's still possible to win. And I do think, and I am thinking a lot. In fact, I'm going to be traveling to a couple law schools this fall, doing some kind of talks about what happens when this fever breaks, and where do we go, and how do we rethink religious freedom, and what can be done. And if you want to frame that more hopefully, have a little fun on Wikipedia with the Lochner era of U.S. legal history, and how it is just this kind of like time frame of like 20 to 30 years where everybody's just kind of like, yeah, I don't know what was going on with the Supreme Court, but we're kind of going to ignore everything it did during that time period. Whatever was happening was really, really weird and bad and wrong. And it's kind of just like this time where it almost doesn't exist in the jurisprudence in a way. That's overstating the case a little bit, but like, we're going to have to come up with a solution after this fever breaks, and as not just a legal profession, but an entire legal system, rethink a lot of what this court has done and the power that it has arrogated to itself after it was captured by this ideological movement.
All right. Well, that's a good place to end, I guess. Thank you, Andrew, for coming onto our show this week. Can you remind our viewers where they can follow your work?
Professionally, I'm at Americans United. That's au.org. Personally, I'm Andrew Seidel on all the socials. Got the new podcast, One Nation Indivisible, which would love for people to go listen to. That's on Brad Onishi's Access Mundi network with Straight White American Jesus and all those other great shows.
Thanks, Andrew. That wraps up this week's episode of FFRF's Ask an Atheist. You can also check out Free Thought Radio at ffrf.org/radio or wherever you listen to podcasts. And also be sure to check out the latest episode of We Dissent, the only podcast hosted exclusively by women constitutional lawyers, including me, discussing state-church separation. Listen and subscribe to We Dissent wherever you get your podcasts. Check us out online at we-dissent.org.
Finally, if you want more information about the Freedom from Religion Foundation, check out our website at ffrf.org. If you're a member already, thank you. If not, please join us, and we will see you next time on FFRF's Ask an Atheist.